Morning, dear participants of the Riga Conference Future Leaders Forum 2016. We are very pleased to welcome you here, to welcome you in Riga, and to welcome you here in the forum. We hope that you will have a successful working day today and tomorrow, and that you will take as much as you possibly can from this event to your future. We want to send your best greetings. We hope that everything is going smooth, and let's start, as we are already a little bit late. Let's start. I want to introduce the moderator of the first panel, Ms. Gunnar, and she will come here with all the speakers of the panel, hopefully.
Thank you. All of them? Perfect.
So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Let's start today.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're ready for a very interesting Future Leaders Summit. I hope you have brought with you the most interesting and challenging questions for our distinct panel here today, which will be the first to kick off the Future Leaders Forum on the margins of the Riga conference. Let me introduce the panelists. First to the left from me, Dr. Ieva Bērziņa, who's the senior researcher at the Latvian Center for Security and Strategic Research at the National Defense Academy here in Riga. General Sir Richard Shirov, former Deputy Supreme Commander, NATO Europe, and a representative from the South, if I may say so, Dr. Balkan Devlin, Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations in Izmir University in Turkey. So, as you know, the focus of our first panel discussion is the 21st century NATO defense and deterrence on the eastern and southern flanks. As you know, NATO has made quite some journey since the Wales summit, which was the first gathering of the heads of state and government of allied countries following the changes in the security landscape in the Euro-Atlantic. And the alliance has taken decisions for both the east and the south of the Euro-Atlantic in order to deter and to protect the territories and citizens of allied countries. Now, this year in Warsaw, the alliance agreed on very significant decisions and steps, in particular for this region, the enhanced forward presence. And we just heard 2 days ago in Brussels during the ministerial meeting that 16 allied nations will be stationing their troops as of next year here in the Baltics and Poland. That includes big allies from west, from north, from south. That includes also some very small allies which have not been training or exercising here together with Baltic troops before. And we have also heard about announcements for helping our southern allies to enhance their defenses. The decision on the maritime operation to help to mitigate the illegal trafficking of migrants and other support elements for our southern flank. But the question remains, is it enough? Is it enough for 21st century? Is it enough for current security challenges that we all face? And that's why I will ask our panel today to share their views on what the current security threats are, and is it enough with a response that the alliance has been able to take up until now. And I'd like to invite Ieva to start with her view on how is the threat perceived in the eastern part of the alliance. What is the assessment of the security challenges or the reasons for the security challenges that we're dealing here in the Baltics?
Okay. Thank you, Gunnar, very much for a kind introduction. And I would like to say hello to all future forum leaders. I hope you will have really fruitful and interesting day today. And it is really my pleasure and honor to participate in this panel. But as my area of research, what I'm doing in my everyday research is more on Russia's strategy and communication. So I will, like Gunnar said, I will try to focus more on Russia's perspective on 21st century's conducting warfare. And so if we speak about challenges and threats, what we face today, then of course if we take a look from a military balance perspective, then of course NATO is the most powerful military alliance in today's world. And in this regard also Vladimir Putin admits that, for example, in this year in St. Petersburg's Economic Forum, he said that United States is perhaps the only superpower in today's world. But the question is, can we be, is it enough, and can we be really safe and sure just relying on military capabilities? And unfortunately, the answer is no, because an opponent or an adversary in the circumstances where it cannot win with conventional means of warfare, he can try to apply to some asymmetric tools. And in this regard, it is interesting to take a look at Russia's military doctrine and Russia's military thought, and how do they understand what contemporary warfare today looks like. And what Russia's military doctrine says as one of the peculiarity of contemporary warfare, it is defined in their document. And they say that in today's warfare is characterized by integrated use of military, political, information, economic, and all other non-military means in an integrated manner, and with the wide use of protest potential in societies that you try to attack. And also it can, and to add to this also the use of special forces. And in this way, how they define features of contemporary warfare, you can largely see reference to what can be called as color revolutions. And in fact, Russia's understanding of this phenomena largely explains their mindset. But I will not go into detail for now into that, but we can discuss during questions and answer sessions. But the idea is, and what also Russians says themselves, and military dangers and risks shift to internal and domestic dimension. This is said from Russia's perspective as threats to Russia, but we also can understand it in the reverse manner. So we also have to take at our domestic issues in the context of 21st century military threats and dangers. And in this regard, it is also what characterizes 21st century military conflicts is that we have additional dimensions of warfare. Traditionally, we have land, air, and sea. Add to this space, cyberspace, and very importantly also is the human mind as a dimension of warfare. And in this regard, I would like to refer, yesterday there was in Russia Valdai Club discussion, and Vladimir Putin gave annual speech in this session, and some ideas I would like to pay your attention to what he said yesterday. And one part of his speech was devoted to internal problems of Western societies. And what he referred to was that dysfunction of Western democratic processes and institutions. What he also said that there is a growing gap between the ordinary people and ruling elites in the Western societies. And also he, interestingly enough, he paid attention to the growing radicalization of Western societies, the increasing importance of radical right and radical left movements. So, what indications does it gives to us? Basically, that we have to shift our focus to internal domain and to what we could call our home front, because what adversaries can attempt and try to do to erupt us internally, domestically, and this is the way how you can overcome this military imbalance, which is in favor to us. And just to mention an example, and I will stop here and give floor to my colleagues, but there was a study done in Germany some months ago, which says that within the supporters of far-right movements in Germany, that they tend to trust Putin more than Merkel. And I think this is one of the problems that we face today, and I will stop here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
General, you have, you on this panel are the one who owns the military expertise and also some very good insights on how the Allied troops are actually shaped. You have also written extensively recently and sort of tried to send a message of warning that the Western societies are not aware of the severity of the threat. We all hope that your book, 2017, War with Russia, is not gonna be title somewhere in the newspapers as reporting actual situation we'll see next year. So with that, you also have most likely your view on the recent decisions on the enhanced forward presence. So the question to you is it enough? Is it good enough for the 21st century? What is missing?
Well, thank you, Gunnar, and thank you for including me on this panel. I mean, you're right. The purpose of the book is to ensure very firmly that the scenario that I outline in this book remains firmly in the pages of fiction, because anything else would represent total catastrophe. In answer to the question, the first thing I'd say is credit where credit is due to the alliance. The alliance has come an immeasurably long way, I think, in the last 2.5 years since the invasion of Crimea, the invasion of eastern Ukraine. But you wouldn't expect me to say that that's good enough, because I think we need to highlight areas where I think much more needs to be done. Yes, the enhanced forward presence has been announced. It was first trailed at the Warsaw Summit in July, and certainly I think at the defense ministerials yesterday or the last couple of days, we've had more granularity on the nature of the enhanced forward presence, and the fact that there are 16 nations going to be engaged is good news. It's firmly multinational, and that's very important, particularly that it includes a number of the southern members of the alliance who were always very traditionally pre-2014 in the camp that said there is no threat here, and that our attention should be directed to the south and to the east of the alliance. But nevertheless, let's look at the facts and figures. NATO is an alliance of 3.5 million men and women under arms. The enhanced forward presence is going to be around about 4,000. And it's going to be based on 4 individual enhanced battalions or battle groups. Now, there will be a combined arms element to that, and that's good news. Actually, my professional military view would be that the minimum requirement would be a combined arms brigade of round about 5,000. Some of you may have seen the RAND study war game, which concluded that in order to defend the Baltic states, 7 brigade of about 5,000, so that's effectively 2 divisions would be required. My own view is that that is beyond what the market will bear, but I think the market will bear a great deal more than for the 4 individual battalions, because we need to think through What is militarily credible? This is about deterrence. Deterrence is about sending a message of capability, that the capability is credible, and of course it's got to be communicated. And I have no doubt that sitting on the other side of the border in the east, the Russians will be looking very carefully at the way this enhanced forward presence is made up. If they conclude, as I believe they will conclude, that this is not a credible military capability, it's a token, it's politically important, yes, but it is very much a political token force, they will conclude, therefore, that the risks are not sufficiently high not to risk potential catastrophe. So what do we need? The first thing we need, going back to where Yeva came from, is a real understanding in NATO around the North Atlantic Council table of what collective defense, Article 5, means in the 21st century in the face of an asymmetric threat. What does it mean in the face of the undermining of the integrity of the state from within through that combination of measures that Yeva discussed, particularly as we're seeing at the moment, cyber, potentially, and this assumption, and I'm conscious of the words of Dmitry Trenin here, who heads the Carnegie Moscow Center, a respected think tank and a man with close connections with the regime in the Kremlin, and in his words, that he has written, the Kremlin has been at war since 2014. What are we thinking about? How are we addressing this? What scenario testing is the NAC and the North Atlantic Council considering? Is it developing the muscle memory to be able to cope and address the challenges of a state within NATO being subjected to asymmetric attack? And at what stage does it then recognize that it may not be an armed attack, but perhaps in the 21st century, armed attack covers a wider dimension than just purely the traditional Cold War view of Soviet tanks rolling across the inner German border. So that's my first point. Second point, as far as the enhanced forward presence is concerned, is the credible military capability of a combined arms brigade with the combat support, the combat service support, so tanks, attack helicopters, artillery, engineers, logistics, and above all, command and control. Because without effective military command and control, unity of command, this force will be just effectively taken piecemeal if push came to shove. Not only that, but it needs to be properly integrated, and the command needs to be properly integrated with the armed forces of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and indeed, I think there is a very strong case for a unified, some form of unified regional command that forms a greater sum of the parts than purely three individual nations. So that would be my second point. My third point is reserves. Again, 3.5 million men and women under arms, and the NATO is talking about a very high readiness joint task force of round about 5,000. At what readiness? How quickly can it get here? Has it trained together? How often does it come and train and operate in the Baltic states? What is the movement plan? What is the readiness plan? All these need to be carefully thought through. There's a lot of work here to be done. The alliance is on the right track, but much, much more needs to be done in this respect. And then my final point would be that, yes, the Wales summit started the ball rolling, but it fell down on one key point, that rather weak statement that the members of the alliance promised to try and raise defense spending to 2% of GDP within the next 10 years. And I've not seen anything since then, apart from a number of individual nations who have put their foot on the accelerator and are trying to reach 2% of GDP on defense spending, which really sends a signal that the alliance has grasped this particular nettle. And in particular, the issue that the European side of NATO, and I would include Canada in this, Europe and Canada, still depend totally on America to pick up the bill. If you look back 25 years and split NATO defense spending between America and Europe and Canada, it was round about 50-50, a 50-50 split. Now it's about a 75%, 25% split. And frankly, that's not good enough, not only because actually the money is needed to regenerate lost capabilities, but it also, in a political sense, gives plenty of ammunition to the isolationist tendencies within the United States, which we've heard from Mr. Trump saying, why on earth should I come to the aid of NATO members if they're not prepared to pick up the bill? My final point, and so I'll finish after this, is back to a military point. What we have seen for the last 2 decades is quite significant operations for NATO, yes, in Afghanistan, particularly, and also the Balkans, and for some, Iraq. Many of those operations have been extremely testing in terms of fighting and combat. And we've seen combat of an intensity which has been pretty devastating, frankly. But let's remember, this is relatively small-scale operations. This is, at the very most, battalion task force or possibly brigade task force. This is not high-end combat maneuver, major formations, divisions, corps, and the like. In a conventional sense, that capability has been lost in NATO. And I would challenge anybody, even the Americans, to get a division, and a division is around about 15 to 20,000, out of the door in less than a few months, frankly. And I think the Americans, of course, have got to bring a division across from the United States, across the Atlantic. But there's no European member of NATO that can get a division out of the door in less than a year, frankly. That is a real issue, because the Russians think big. The Russians think divisions. They think they've formed 3 motor rifle divisions on the frontiers of the Baltic states since January and announced that. They think tank armies. They think airborne divisions. And even back in Georgia, for all the problems that they demonstrate, that they clearly experienced, they were still able to mobilize forces, formations of a size which NATO can't even begin to think about. So that would be my final point. Getting the thinking for high-end combat operations back on the agenda.
Thank you very much, General. Now, turning to the southern flank, and clearly the assumption or the understanding is that the challenges that NATO faces in the south are way less clear than they are in the eastern flank. Most likely, I won't be wrong by saying that in this part of the world, a little is heard, known, and analyzed on what's actually going on and what NATO and other international organizations are actually providing our southern ally, Turkey, and the region itself in terms of stability and defense support. And the question now to our last panelist, Dr. Devlin, is how is it perceived from Turkey's point of view right now in fall 2016? How do you see the situation there, and how do you see the link between what NATO as an alliance is doing in the southern flank? And by that, I'm also including the wider region, all the defense capacity building initiatives, the cooperation that we have with partners there in order to make the region more stable and secure.
Well, thank you very much for the organizers first having me here. It's a pleasure to be back in sunny Riga again, and I hope it will be better throughout the day. I think there are two issues to that, and 2 basic challenges. One has to do with the political stability of the NATO member countries in the southern flank. And this is not only Turkey, at least Turkey is the major concern right now here, but this also includes Greece because of the refugee flows, but this also includes other, we will come to that in a few minutes, but we would also include other NATO members such as Italy due to, again, refugee flows from North Africa. So one is that to what extent the increasing political instability because of the developments in the southern flank could have an impact. The second, I think, problem is the wider issue within the alliance or within the member countries of increasing populist, nativist sentiments as a result, largely as a result of the developments in the southern flank, particularly in Syria, but to also limited extent in Iraq and Libya. And again, this all ties with the refugee problem. Now, there are 2 issues there. One is the flow of people coming to Europe via Turkey and then Greece mainly, but also there's the other route from North Africa to Italy. The second issue is, of course, the issue of terrorism that the ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State, whatever you want to name it, is incubating, and it's not going to go necessarily away, regardless of the fact that what happens in Mosul and maybe later in Raqqa. The issue of returning foreign fighters, so on and so forth. So the issue of jihadist terrorism that would continue to be a major issue for the European members and for North American members of NATO as well. And this is tied to the way that how we can respond to this as NATO. Again, it's a problem mainly because NATO is fundamentally is a defensive alliance, and a defense is generally thought about the territorial defense. How would you be able to deal with major flow of people? They're not tanks, they're not moving army divisions, but they're people. And how are you going to deal with this? The security issues and the population integration issues and economic issues with that. The second issue is, of course, there has been, at least since 9/11, an increasing capacity for NATO to deal with terrorist threat. But again, fundamentally, when you look at it, I am not really sure that NATO is equipped properly to deal with terrorist threats, partly because there are different national legislation that defines terrorism in different ways. There are different mechanisms, multiple national mechanisms that deal with terrorist threats. There's intelligence issues, so on and so forth. So what NATO can do to face these particular threats on the southern flank? I think two things are crucial. One is an understanding of how the developments in the southern flank, particularly the war in Syria, and the sort of the disintegration, continuing disintegration of Iraq, poses, what sort of a threat it poses to the political stability of NATO member countries. And Turkey is one example. Some of you might have probably followed that there was a coup attempt back in July in Turkey, and the political situation is not necessarily too great right now either, but the security situation in Turkey, especially in the south, and emanating from both the terrorist activities as well as ethnic tensions and insurgencies, is putting a lot of pressure on the way that Turkey can deal with these issues. And the destabilization of a major ally would have major implications for the alliance. The second issue is, again, how to deal with the refugee flow, how to deal with the people coming all across Middle East, Africa, and North Africa to Europe. Now, the numbers may not seem too great in the large scheme of things. We're talking a couple million at this stage of a continent for 500 million or so people. But politically, it's a bombshell. And it is one of the major reasons why the increasing right-wing populist, nativist parties and movements gaining ground. And that will probably going back, link it to Russia again, would be a major destabilizing force within the alliance because it encourages isolationist tendencies within the member countries. It encourages fortress mentality. Let's close down the border. Let's close down this and that, and let's limit this and that. That is a major problem for an alliance that relies on more or less coordination and solidarity. And how NATO can deal with this? Well, yes, the task forces in the Mediterranean is a start, but it will not necessarily prevent or stop anything. On the contrary, it might end up encouraging further flows, as it seems to be the case, at least in 2016, with regards to the crossings from Libya, because, well, it's a moral hazard. You know that there is a NATO mission, you know that there is a European Union mission, so they might end up saving you rather than letting you drown, so you send more people. And thus, up until today, I think it was 3,800 people drowned in the Mediterranean in 2016 so far, and it's an increase from 2015. So there are political dilemmas, issues. Are you not going to go and help people? Well, if you do, more people come, eventually more people will die. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to sell this to your publics as well as the world public opinion. These are major issues, and how, to what extent NATO as an alliance could do something here. I think that's the $6 million question. The issue, at least the way I see it, NATO can do two things. One, that it can work to convince or to sell this idea to its publics better. All right, so more in terms of creating resilience within the societies. If you go back and remember what George Kennan wrote in the sort of the X article and before the telegram, containment has also a domestic component. It's less of a military issue, although he uses the military terminology when he was writing and selling it to the administration. It's also a political and psychological dynamic. So one part of it is pushing back to the adversary, but the other part is building up the resilience within the alliance members, within the country, within the member states. And that starts with identifying and making sure that the publics understand what the threats are in a much more stark terms, and thus calling for action to be a lot more alert and to be a lot more aware of the threats that the alliance poses. So that's one thing, I think, working for the domestic audiences. The second one is, again, a much clearer realization that the central actor in both cases seems to, or at least one of the central actors, seems to be Russia, both in the eastern flank and the southern flank. When you look at it, the major reason for the refugee flows from Syria is not ISIS. It's the Syrian government's bombing of the cities. It's that actually pushes the people out. And Assad's regime survives mainly thanks to the Russian support, and Russians seems to be there for a while. Initially, when they started the operations, people were not necessarily thinking that they're going to stay longer. All this about this turning into Russia's Vietnam. Well, it didn't so far. And to what extent Russia is using the war in Syria to put pressure on NATO in a different way. Are we shifting from one side to the other? As we shift our attention to southern flank, would further tensions happen in the north and in the eastern flank? Again, how to deal with Russia and push back, and not only in the eastern flank, but also in the southern flank, seems to be one of the questions we need to be able to answer, and I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you very much for your very interesting views. Now, let's start the discussion with questions and comments from the audience. I understand we have a mic there, and let us pick a couple of questions. Please introduce yourself when you're posing the question, and then we'll turn to the panel.
Good morning to everyone. My name is Mikola Demchuk. I'm representing Ukraine. And I'm addressing my question to Mr. Devlin. We all witness that relations between Turkey and the EU are getting worse, especially after the coup in July, when Erdogan blamed Western leaders, let's say, for that they did not actively and directly condemn the coup. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we also witness that relations between Turkey and Russia, Erdogan tries to cultivate and restore good relations. So can we expect in the future that Turkey could be a sort of opposition inside NATO to stop any good initiatives of NATO? Because as we all know, the decision taken in NATO by consensus, so it could be really easy to stop it. And the second question, if
Go ahead.
you let me to ask, I'm addressing to Mr. Shirif. So on your personal opinion, how do you think, what could be the real actions of NATO in case of Russian invasion of the whole Ukraine, or the majority, or the Russian invasion will become more inside Ukraine? What could be the real actions of NATO, and what is generally the strategy of NATO regarding Ukraine?
Thank you. Some more questions for the first round? Yes, over here.
Carmen Râșnăveanu, Institute for Political Studies, Romania. well, I'm coming from a country which is part of, how call them, frontline states, yeah? And of course, it's a Black Sea littoral country. So my question or questions regard the Black Sea security issues. Well, it's obvious that the Warsaw NATO summit focused especially on the northeastern part of the eastern flank, yes, Poland and Baltic states. The increased NATO presence in this area leaves the Black Sea quite exposed, and is not very clear in which or in what extent within the alliance there is a consensus on how to deal with the Black Sea security issues or with Russian policy within this area. Although what we see, it's a rapid militarization of the Crimean Peninsula and a growing power projection of Russia within the Black Sea. So I would have two questions. The first one is for General. Sir, how do you think that NATO should approach the fact that the strategic balance in the Black Sea has changed in Russian favor? Or to be more specific, does NATO has a strategy now to deal with the new Russian power projection in the Black Sea? And the second question goes to Professor Devlen. Sir, as an academic, do you think that Turkey might consider at any point in time the possibility to update the Montreux Convention in order to allow a more consolidated NATO presence in the Black Sea in case of a need or a danger? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we start with the general, maybe,
Okay.
on the Black Sea and then Ukraine?
Well, let's start with Ukraine, and of course, this is a question. Both questions, in a sense, relate to the Black Sea, and I note that in recent years, it's been Georgia, it's been Crimea, and it's also been Ukraine, where Russia has made its presence felt in a perhaps overweening manner. As far as Ukraine is concerned, of course, while a valued partner of NATO, and I remember the contribution to Ocean Shield by the Ukrainian Navy, Ukraine is not a member of NATO and therefore is not covered by that fundamental guarantee of collective defense, which we know so well. But that is not to say that NATO cannot provide support, and you'd have to ask somebody who's serving in NATO today to elaborate on that particular area, because I'm not cited on it. But it can cover training support, capacity building, and the like. But I think we have to remember with NATO that NATO's fundamental strength remains its alliance cohesion. That is the source of strength, its center of gravity. And the way to maintain alliance cohesion is to ensure that NATO remains a defensive alliance and remains underpinned by Article 5. And anything more than that begins to stretch and put extra tension within the alliance. My own view, therefore, is that the best way to provide Western support for Ukraine is through bilateral means between individual nations. Perhaps they may be part of NATO, but I think also that avoids the notion that NATO can be seen, therefore, as Ukraine's foreign legion, which is another standard accusation from the other side of the border. And I believe that support should be extensive. In fact, I know that the debate continues in the United States, for example, about whether there should be lethal support or not. It's about deterrence. It's about holding the line. And if that requires lethal support, providing the necessary lethal support, providing the necessary legal aspects that are properly taken care of, I see no reason why there should not be lethal support provided by allies on a bilateral basis to Ukraine to avoid precisely the circumstances you outlined, which is a Russian attack against the whole of Ukraine, which I have to say back in March 2014 looked very likely. And it's the fact that it has not happened is a a mark of great credit, frankly, on Ukraine and the Ukraine armed forces that they've managed to help the line. But I'm sure that more could be done in terms of support on a bilateral basis. If I can just turn now to the Black Sea question, Madam, and the point you raised about, you asked me a direct question of what is NATO's strategy to the Black Sea. The answer is, I don't know, because I'm not in NATO and haven't been for 2.5 years. As you were articulating your question, my answer was going to be, there is a need for an overarching strategy that takes account, and I think the point here is, and it's a wider point perhaps than purely the Black Sea. Russia, of course, is not only a European power, but it's a Black Sea power, it's a South Asian power, and it's a Far Eastern power. So Russia has to think strategically. And I've no doubt that there is a strategic linkage in the Kremlin between what happens in Europe, what happens on the boundaries of the frontiers of the Baltic states, what happens as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, and despite the second Minsk ceasefire, we know that that war continues. I'm certain that there is a sort of a conscious effort to turn the gas flame down in Ukraine while the gas flame is turned up in Syria. So there's a strategic linkage between the two, as indeed there is a strategic linkage directly with the Black Sea. I think your point about NATO focusing enhanced forward presence on in the Baltic states and eastern Poland is well made, but I would observe that I know, for example, that part of the UK announcement was the deployment of UK fast jets, multi-role attack aircraft also into Romania. So that there is, I think, a recognition of the importance of enhancing and maintaining a NATO presence, not only in the Baltics, but also in Bulgaria and Romania as well. But there is a requirement for an overarching strategy, and NATO needs to think, and I'm sure it is doing, and well, maybe Gunnar can answer this one, I don't want to turn it back to you, but I would hope that NATO is thinking strategically between Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and the importance of maintaining that NATO balance in the Black Sea as well.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'll start with the relatively easy one, that is the Montreux. Well, everything is possible in life, but I don't really expect that in any meaningful time frame for a couple of reasons. That seems to be, well, Montreux is one of the fundamental, at least the way you look at it, since the establishment of the Republic after the Montreux Agreements. It is one of the sort of fundamental untouchables of Turkish diplomacy. So it would require a major crisis with Russians, and that would mean basically if there is a fight broke out with the Russians and Turks in the Black Sea with the Navy and whatnot, then Turkey might think about changing the Montreux Agreement and allow more NATO presence. Otherwise, I really doubt that the government would go down there. The policy has been for a while, and again, when the Black Sea started to be talked more and more after the end of Cold War, the Turkish approach so far had been to keep it out of sort of tensions, and to keep sort of the Black Sea as much as possible. Some would call it a Turkish-Russian condominium, so it's sort of the two things between, and don't want any non-literal states to be present there. And with a few, changes here and there, that remained the policy. Now, is it at this stage, especially after Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea, is it a smart thing to do? That's a different story. And again, I'm not necessarily here talking for the Turkish government, but if they were to ask me, I would say that we need to, and not only Turkey, but also other littoral states, Bulgaria, Romania, need to invest a lot more on A2AD capabilities, anti-access area denial capabilities, because the Russians are increasing, and Black Sea is turning slowly into a Russian lake. Would that gonna happen? I don't know, but that's one need to be done. Would it be politically feasible, particularly changing the Montreux? No, it's not gonna happen that way. The question regarding the sort of the separation with Turkey and Russia for a year or so, and then making up after a while, and would that pose a problem for further sort of action against Russia within NATO? I think there are two possibilities. One, two ways to go. One, when you look at Turkish-Russian relations from a historical perspective, the current period is an anomaly. The traditional relation between Turkey and whoever controlled this part of the world at the time, the Ottoman Empire, has always been, with Russia, has been mostly antagonistic. And there are reasons for it, partly having a big sort of power on your borders, north and east, but also there's a traditional aversion for Russian influence within Turkey. So there is, historically, this sort of relatively warm relations is an anomaly. To what extent this would continue, I am not sure. There is, at least within the Turkish diplomatic tradition and as well as the military tradition, with an exception of a minority group of more Eurasianist-oriented officers, the attitudes towards Russia is generally one of suspicion, to speak. Why the recent changes? I think the major issue is, so far, up until at least the incident with the Russian plane being shut down, to keep the economic, particularly economic relations with Russia, Turkey and Russian economic relations, separate from the developments of broader political and military developments. That didn't necessarily work out. I mean, it did work out in a sense that when you look at what Erdogan was saying after the start of the Syrian war, Russia has been one of the biggest supporters of Assad regime, but he was very careful in avoiding any sort of tension there, try not to mention too much, try not to get too antagonistic with Putin in regards to Syria. That changed after 2014. The current sort of renewal is much more of a necessity, I would say, rather than a desire to close up, to get closer with Russia. It is a necessity, I think, in the sense that the policymakers have other priorities, particularly with regards to be able to influence the developments in Syria and to a limited extent in Iraq. To be able to do that, given the facts on the ground, Turkey needed to be able to at least come to a modus vivendi with Russia to be able to operate in Syria. Because after we shut down the Russian plane, there is a reason why we use strikes from the border, artillery strikes, rather than the planes, because we couldn't get the planes in. And if we did, the Russians might have taken it out. Now we could operate in northern Syria, and we might be able to operate in northern Iraq as well. So there is, I think, a trade-off there, and the price was that this relation should be set up again. That doesn't necessarily mean that Turkey would be much more of an obstacle to a more stronger stand against Russia than some of the other NATO members who were not too keen on, say, pushing back the Russian influence, even in major powers like Germany. So I would not necessarily think that it would carry over there too much. This is more of an agreement and modus vivendi out of necessity at this stage. To what extent this would develop something beyond that remains to be seen, and I hope that would not be the case.
What about Turkey, EU? I mean, the question
yes.
was...
Well, that is a totally different, I think, ball game, and I'm not an expert in Turkey-EU relations, but I think it is plain to see that it is more the game of who would blink first right now rather than anything else. I don't see any reasonable prospect for membership in this century. Forget about the next 10 20 years. And it became much more of a transactional relation with the European Union asking for this, Turkey asking for that, and trying to push this and that. Erdogan's comments were, whatever you think of him, was to the point right after the coup attempt. The criticism or the support for the government came a bit late and not to the extent that Turkey was expecting from partners in Europe. So that is true. But would that be a major problem for Turkish-EU relations later on? No, because it became very transactional at this stage. It has, I really don't think, I mean, we all keep the game of membership negotiations and stuff, but it provides something for the bureaucrats to do, I think, and it is about who would blink first and decide to say, okay, we're not going to do this. So here's what you're going to do. It's a negotiation. Who will concede more is the issue. So that's it.
All right, thank you. Let's first go to the left and then to the far left. The speed was...
Yes, hello, my name is Gry Falkenstrøm from Danish Institute for International Studies. My first question is for Dr. Berzina regarding this this dimension of the human mind as a dimension of warfare, which has, of course, gained a lot of attention within the recent years. How do you think NATO can engage in activities in this dimension without entering the narrative of propaganda, counter-propaganda, which is, after all, undermining NATO's claim to democratic values? And the second question will be to, just a second, will be to you, General Sheriff. I was recently at a Russia conference in Copenhagen where the claim was that under the Second World War, the confrontation line was going through Berlin. But in this new period, this confrontation line between the West and the East, Russia, will be in the Baltic Sea. Do you agree on this? And if you do you think that increased militarization will be the way to restore the balance? Or do you think this will actually be the security threat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's continue on the left side, and the next, I promise, we'll do in this one. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, dear participants, for your...
Just use the mic, please.
Good morning. Thank you for your insightful contributions, all four of you. My first question I'd like to direct to General Sheriff. You've mentioned the many elements that have come together with irregular or unconventional warfare. In that sense, do you foresee also an increasing role in civil-military cooperation for the future? Because I've studied this subject actually also extensively at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. In fact, considering NATO's institutional setup, it's been over its history more military heavy and much less on allocating assets or structures to tackle the civilian aspect of irregular warfare. Maybe at national level we can discuss otherwise, but do you think that a few center of excellence like the Civil Military Cooperation Center or the CMDR will be instrumental in this one? How do you see this evolve? And my second question for Dr. Devlin, you've mentioned that we should work more with the publics and prepare the audience's mindsets to foster security cultures, also a subject I've been reading up on much more. So in order to boost resilience, as you mentioned. But this, I think, requires a whole of society approach, which is a gigantic effort. I can't help but think of historical and also the situation in Israel, for instance, which is a country that has for over 6 decades been thwarted by irregular warfare and terrorism. In that sense, if we think back those who are following military history, there's an interesting case which was Operation Entebbe, in which the actual in advance situational awareness and knowledge of the hostages, which were Israeli citizens, were instrumental in the successful release and military operation that released them. Do you think this is a template that should be sort of standardized or even more brought into mainstream for all the military, all the NATO, the populations in the NATO allied countries? Thank you.
And one more, first row.
Thank you. Ulrik Smed from Denmark. Thank you very much, distinguished gentlemen and women. I'd just like to poke into the question about military credibility, General. And this might also be a question for you, Miss, regarding Russian strategy. So, do we really need full military parity in the Baltics in order to be credible, or is it enough to have political credibility with a tripwire in the Baltics? How much? Question is maybe, I know the Russian bear is poking us, but how much do we need to poke it back? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we start this time with you?
Okay, I will. Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, and considering the battle for minds. And among other things, what Putin said yesterday in Valdai was very important, and I think he pointed at one of our vulnerability. And what he said was that actually there is a lack on a global scale of a future vision. So what is our future project? What is our future vision? And also there was an article written by Lavrov this year about Russia's foreign policy, and in this he also says that what we experience today is a competition between future development of the world. So I think to answer your question, I would say that of course, we have to be aware of Russia's mindset, of Russia's tools and techniques, but I think the deeper problem is not so much different ways how Russia fakes information and how it influences us, but rather that it is steadily and constructing different worldview and different belief system. And the problem is that this system, to some extent, is appealing and it resonates with certain groups in our societies. And this is a problem, and we must answer the question, why is it so? Why people tend to believe and tend to accept this mindset? So I would say that our first focus should be on our internal vulnerabilities and on strengthening the relationship between societies and governments and ruling elites. And since NATO is a military alliance, I think it more has to be focused at the level of national governments, I would argue. Because you are right, and I absolutely agree with you that with countering those narratives, we risk also lose credibility in our societies, and we have to understand it. So.
General, the question of the size.
Just a general point, which picks up, I think, on the last discussion. The reality of 21st century conflict is absolutely war among the people. That any military operation needs to be subjected to one critical criterion. What impact is what I'm going to do going to have on the minds of the people amongst whom I'm operating? Now, the minds of the people is a broad church. Clearly, it's the people in the theatre of operations. That requires a deep and comprehensive understanding of the kaleidoscope of complexity of the nature of the society. There's an international dimension, there's a regional dimension, of course there's a domestic dimension as well. So credibility is fundamental. But at the same time, it is about telling a more compelling narrative than the narrative which your adversary is telling. So there is absolutely an information dimension here, and we'll be hearing later, I think, and it's no surprise that the NATO Centre of Excellence for Information Operations is here in Latvia. And credibility collapses like a popped balloon if there's a hint of propaganda about it. But the challenge remains major. The new confrontation line and how much is enough, which I'll take together. I think absolutely that in the same way that during the Cold War there was a spotlight shining on Berlin, now as far as defenses in Europe is concerned, if we are in a new Cold War, and I'm not sure necessarily we are, I think it in some ways is more dangerous than the Cold War, and I say that because actually in the later part of the Cold War there was a relative stability as a result of the balance of armed forces on either side of the Iron Curtain. But absolutely now that spotlight shines on the Baltic region. not just the Baltic states, but you have to include the wider Baltic region, including Finland and Sweden as well, which raises other issues and questions. You, I think, asked what does that require increased military presence, and in a sense it elides with the question about parity. Absolutely no, we do not need parity. In today's London Times leader, it cites the fact that there are 330,000 Russian troops in the Baltic region, in Western Military District and Northern Military District. Clearly we can't match that. We don't need to match that. But what we do need to do is raise the bar of risk high enough so that any decision maker in the Kremlin thinks it's just simply not worth my while. If the bar of risk is not high enough, then somebody somewhere might just think, yeah, it's worth a go. That's what we've got to avoid. Well, how high is the bar of risk? As I said in my opening remarks, I don't believe we're in the business of the 7 brigades that the Rand war game concluded. I suggest that a properly combined arms brigade in the Baltic states, permanent as part of the enhanced forward presence, is probably about enough. But it needs to be worked together with a combined joint concept of operations which integrates the forces of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia together under a single command, integrates the NATO enhanced forward presence within that joint single command, integrates maritime and air forces as well, and that also allows for the rapid inflow of NATO reserves, significant NATO reserves. Initially, the spearhead is the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, backed up by the NATO response force. And that needs to be practiced, it needs to be worked upon. It needs a program of exercises. And again, we can learn a great deal by looking back to the years of the Cold War here, with the program of reforger exercises, the reinforcement of the Central Front, the combined army group concept of maneuver operations, all of which sends a signal that the alliance has thought it through, is ready, and isn't just putting four individual enhanced battalions as a sort of tripwire and then leaving it behind. But it requires a constant program. It requires regular call-outs. It requires maintenance of presence. For example, in the years of the Cold War, none of the standing forces was allowed to have more than 25% of personnel away on leave and courses, and all that was pretty regularly checked by shape. And you'd have NATO monitors descend on you, and they would mark and judge a battalion's ability or a unit's ability to be called out at very short notice, and it was pretty embarrassing when there were shortfalls. So this is the sort of structure that we need. But absolutely, we're not in the business of military parity. There was another piece you said, which was the provocation question. Does this provoke? Are we poking the Russian bear? Well, I've no doubt that the announcement at yesterday's defense ministers will create howls of outrage and claims of NATO encirclement and forward basing means that NATO is about to use the Baltic states as a springboard for attack. I think I would say to that, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? My reading, and I defer to others with a much greater understanding of Russia, but my reading is that actually the Russians respect strength and they despise weakness. And where they see weakness, they'll continue to probe, to test, to overfly. Where they see strength, okay, they've got it, they'll back off. There might be a lot of howls of horror, but fundamentally, unless NATO can be seen to be strong, then there won't be the necessary deterrence. So it comes back to the business of credible deterrence.
I would like to add on your question on military parity, different angle how to look at the problem. And I mentioned already that to understand Russian mindset, you have to take a look how do they understand color revolutions, which they consider as being tools of influence by the West, and what they have learned, how do they understand it? That in order, you don't need to occupy, because occupying a territory, it is very cost you a lot in terms of financial resources, in terms of casualties, it discredits your international image, so you have to exert influence without occupying a state. And also what their military doctrine says that try all other tools first and military as the latest. And you have to achieve your goals with the least military resources as possible. So we rather should also be rather concerned about those non-military aspects and indirect influence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, there was another question somebody asked about civil military.
Indeed,
Yeah.
Yeah.
civil military cooperation and the whole society approach.
Yeah. Shall I address that one?
Sure.
Absolutely. Sorry, I should have talked about that earlier. The civil military piece is fundamental, and I'm also, as a fellow of the GCSP, I'm delighted that you're engaged there too. This is the nature. This is absolutely the requirement. I mean, we've seen the closest, the application of the comprehensive approach in crisis management operations, the recognition that in the sort of operations NATO's been conducting in Afghanistan and the Balkans, the closest possible cooperation with the wide range of other agencies in the battle space is absolutely fundamental to the achievement of security. But civil military is fundamental here in this sort of Article 5 context as well, not least to address the asymmetric aspect. Hence, for example, the importance of the closest complementary relationship between NATO and EU. NATO, arguably hard power, EU application of soft power, influence, building up of civic society, putting money into social development programs in socially deprived areas, such, for example, as the significant amount of money the EU put into Narva, that city on the Estonian-Russian border. And I think more widely, it's the business of partnerships too, and NATO needs to be ready to build. NATO is supremely well equipped, actually, to build partnerships, as it demonstrated with the campaign in Afghanistan, with some 22 partner nations engaged in that campaign. But I think NATO needs to think through what you might call non-traditional partners. It's very comfortable with working with humanitarian organizations, the United Nations, the EU, in many of the Geneva-based organizations. But actually, I think there's a case here for engagement with the private sector, with Google, banking, to address the wide range of the other levers of power that need to be addressed in this whole business, in this whole game of deterrence.
Well, I think, two things I want to add. One, to follow on what the general said regarding should we poke back the Russian bear. Well, one way, I was told by people who goes on hunting and might end up coming with a grizzly or a brown bear, that if you don't have anything with you, you better make a lot of noise and try to look as big as possible to scare off the bear. And you don't have to poke the Russians back, but you need to be able to show that you are not necessarily to be messed with. And that, I think I agree. And fundamentally, that goes back to the reliance on actual hard power. I mean, a lot of, when we talk about hybrid warfare, a lot of emphasis was put on the hybrid part of it, but it is fundamentally warfare. And it's about whether you can actually end up killing people or not, and whether you can do that or whether you can stop people from killing. So I think one needs to think NATO needs to think more carefully about the capability and the credibility of force being stationed and whether they can actually physically do that. Conventional deterrence is notoriously hard to achieve because it's very easy to miscalculate to do so. Now, nuclear deterrence is a different story, etc. And I have a question for the general, his views on what the tactical nukes should play, or should they play a role in deterring Russia, because they do have plans of using it. They simulated on dropping one on the Danish Navy, simulating one on dropping on a Danish island, on Riga, etc., as a tool for de-escalation, and not escalation, but a de-escalation. So that is something I think that I'm hoping thinking in thoroughly. The issue of whole society approach, and what can we learn from Israel? I think it's a very, very good point. And Israelis developed that being surrounded by hostile nations around, that situational awareness to live with. And it's a unique situation in one sense, I think. What I'm not necessarily advocating is a total development of a national security state, but I think there's a lot to learn from there and adapt to increase the way that Russian propaganda and subversion, I mean, we keep talking about hybrid warfare, there is a good old word for it from Cold War, which was subversion, engaging in funding various right-wing, left-wing groups, sowing dissent, creating disinformation, misinformation, etc., increasing awareness of that within NATO member states. Some work has been done both NATO with the strategic communications centers and with the EU's disinformation center, but I'm not sure that is enough. The resources devoted there is very, very limited, should definitely be expanded, and it is, I think fundamentally it also starts with, and it should start with, a clear identification of who the adversary is. And I think we're doing the wrong job if we keep denying that we are facing a revanchist, aggressive Russia. And if we start saying, we're not seeing Russia as a threat, it's not this and that, and trying to play nice would not necessarily work out that way. Identifying who the adversary is and what they are capable of and engaging in is the first step to let the population and the public know about how to deal with it. And if you keep saying that, no, we are actually friends, they just drink too much and happen to create problems right now, but we'll be okay once this is gone, is the wrong approach. And I think we should be much more aware of that, and that starts with the whole society approach. Situational awareness starts with identifying the possible threats first and foremost.
Thank you, General. The question within the panel on the nuclear dimension, the nuclear rhetorics of Russia, the nuclear dimension in the recent exercises, how should we interpret that, and what should we do with that interpretation or the conclusion that we have come?
Well, this rather chilling term, nuclear de-escalation, deserves serious attention because it's potentially catastrophic. And what appears to happen is, as part of the final phase of a snap exercise, we seize our objective. If NATO comes back at us, we threaten NATO with tactical nuclear weapons. And of course, we just heard yet again, I don't know why they don't leave them there, because the Iskanders seem to be in and out of Kaliningrad, rather like a commuter going in and out of the local city. And of course, it's not only the Baltic states within easy range of Kaliningrad, but also Warsaw, Berlin, possibly Copenhagen, possibly Stockholm as well. To be effective, deterrence has to match a potential adversary at every level. And if there is a major gap between, well, I think arguably, if there's a major gap at a conventional level, and all you can do is have recourse to intercontinental ballistic missiles, that is exceptionally dangerous, because it means you can only either you go nuclear and you have mutually assured destruction, or you just hold your hands up and surrender and say, okay, you can have it. I think there's a lesson from the Cold War here. The Soviet Union deployed SS-20s to East Germany. What was Reagan's response? Cruise missiles into Europe. Okay, got the message. So I think, actually, that to be effective, deterrence needs to match at every level. To deter tactical nuclear weapons, NATO needs to think through the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons as well. Now, this actually means the United States. I don't know about France, but certainly UK, as the other nuclear power in NATO, the third nuclear power in NATO, does not have a tactical nuclear capability. So the other point I'd make about NATO and nuclear is that at the end of the Cold War, the whole issue of nuclear and thinking about nuclear was rather put into a box, and the key was turned, and it was left up to the three nuclear-armed nations of NATO to sort of get on with it on a unilateral basis. So the answer is yes, I think NATO does need to think through the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons.
All right, thank you. The right side, let's start with the second row here and then go around. All right. So you had a monopoly. Go ahead.
Possession is.
I have two main questions. I have two main questions. I'll start over. Thank you for a great panel. My name is Albin Aronson. I represent Sweden, and we've talked about the Baltic Sea a lot today. And my first question regards the deployment of 2 Russian new missile corvettes into the Baltic Sea this week. And if you could comment on how that may change the military balance in the Baltic Sea. And if that changes it, of course, how should NATO respond more immediately, except for statements from the meeting, of course? And my second question is that how sort of likely do you think that it is that the Kremlin decides to make a significant move in the sort of relative power vacuum between the American election and when the next president assumes office in January? Thank you.
Thank you. The second row here, please.
Okay. So, 2 questions for Mr. Richard. The first question is that you mentioned...
Do you mind, please?
Okay, great. It works. First question is that you mentioned integrated command. I'm very interested to know that what do you think the mechanism should be, and what this mechanism will lead to the substantive differences from the past? And the second question is that how do you think that to keep the balance between Russia and ISIS, those 2 forces, in the next 5 years or 10 years of NATO's strategy? Okay, thank you.
On the far end, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm from Portugal. I wanted to thank the panel, and I wanted to address to you, Dr. Yeva, mainly, but it's extendable to the entire panel, because also Professor Volkan talked about the formulation of foreign policy is made domestically, and we should acknowledge that, for instance, a country like mine, Portugal, it is not that relevant for a major power or superpower like the UK or the United States within the NATO alliance. And regarding Putin, I wanted to ask to you, Professor, one thing directly. He uses his military power and idea of imperialism on formulation of foreign policy to hide his lack of economic policy, because we see his foreign policy is very strong, but his domestic policies maybe not that strong. And until how long can he play with this game? Until how long he's able to have these double standards? And how can his imperialism be confronted to not so imperialism from my country, for instance, Portugal? But at the same time, the southern flank, as Professor Balkan said, is very important. And how can these double standards within the NATO alliance can help to provide a better approach to Putin's imperialism? Thank you.
Let's try quickly one more at the very end as the last one.
Thank you. Good morning. Rick Jacobus from the Netherlands. I have 2 questions. First of all, it was one of the things that struck me. You spoke about Syria being a bigger threat than ISIS, and I would like to hear some. Maybe I misquote you now.
No, I said that the major source for refugees is not so much the ISIS, but the Assad regimes of bombing the civilians.
Okay, now this answers the first question. No, because I just didn't get it. Sorry.
That's okay.
The second question I have is a little bit in between, perhaps, for the general and also for Dr. Berzinja. I live in Latvia. I've been here 4 years, and of course, a lot of people are asking about the Latvian-Russian relationships inside Latvia, and we've just spoken also about, the theater of the mind and the war amongst people. I've heard. One of my questions is, the EU has battle groups consisting of 18 battalions and 33,000 manpower. What I've heard from people who are Russian-speaking Latvians is that they feel that NATO, of course, with the US, is too much under influence of the US. So my question specifically for Dr. Berzina is, how do you feel if the choice would have been to deploy here the EU battalions, which are not including US, and then when and if Russia would have some kind of attack or any of these things, it would still trigger the article of NATO that, you know, an attack on one of the states is an attack on everyone. So would that take away some of the sting that is with Russian-speaking nationals here, and would have made that a little bit, you know, would it have de-escalated? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is you the answer?
Okay. I will start. Actually, I think your question, they are somehow similar. Can Russia do this? And I would like to refer to an analogy that you said, that in order to scare the bear, if you are not armed, you need to make a lot of noise. And I'd like to reverse it, because from my perspective, Russia is actually acting rather from the sense of weakness and the sense of strength. And in many things what they do, I think they make noise to appear a bit stronger than they actually are. That, of course, I may be wrong, but that's my my perception. And will they use this chance between? I don't know, of course. But let me remind, when the Ukraine crisis started, then immediately the question raised up, who will be the next? Will the Baltics be the next? And we were like really worried and scared, and nothing happened. I would rather, my guess would be that rather no than yes. But of course it's always very tricky. But how long is it sustainable? Well, in terms of propaganda, what we have been talking so far was that Russia's propaganda is somewhat effective in the Western states, but very effective in Russia. Although I would like to take a look at the latest Duma elections. And I think the low turnout in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and also the high falsification rate, for me it is an indicator that there is also some changes happening in Russian societies, and that Russian society is not so happy about what's going on. Where it will take and what developments it will take, taking into consideration the huge restrictions that are being done on Russian civil society within the last years, especially after Maidan, of course I don't know, but there is problems, and also add to these economic problems. And I think this explains to me, if you take a look at Russia's rhetoric for a longer period of time, then you see that it is very dialogue oriented, and what Putin calls for very much in what he says, that there needs to be dialogue. Of course, the dialogue needs to be on his terms, and Russia must be respected as equal partner, and its sphere of interests must be respected. But it's very, it's rather cooperative and defensive than aggressive, actually. I would argue. So that's, but of course we don't know. We are not in their heads, so it's just our guess. Coming back to the perceptions of Russian-speaking part of Latvian populations and their attitude towards NATO. Well, I don't think if that would. It could make a difference, probably, if not U.S., but we have Canadian forces here, so I assume that you're referring to certain anti-Americanism, but I think we rather should look at it in a general NATO perspective, and we have to keep in mind that our Russian-speaking population is largely consuming mass media in Russian language. And also they are using sources from Russia, and therefore they are very much living in the narrative of NATO promoted by Russia, which is something totally different that we do here, and there is really what we experience here is the battle of narratives. So I would say we somehow need to address this issue and rather to look for ways how NATO can deliver its message to Russian-speaking audiences in the Baltic states. I would say this is rather what we should focus at. Yeah. So,
Welcome.
Two things, I think. One is that in the long term, I agree, given the Russian economy, the population trends, and so on and so forth, they will not necessarily pose much of a threat in a grand scheme of things. But that doesn't mean that a wounded bear is still a bear. You still need to, you keep abusing the analogy here, but you still need, Putin's regime could still wreak quite a bit of havoc given the Russian resources and the willingness to use that. I mean, it is one thing to point out that in overall terms, the Russian capabilities, economic and military capabilities, is not a match for the combined NATO capabilities, but it's another thing for the balance of willingness to be able to use and absorb costs on the other hand. To what extent, what I see is that there is asymmetry between NATO and Russia in terms of the willingness to absorb political, economic, and military costs for particular strategic purposes. That is, I think, what fundamentally gives Russia the leverage. NATO keeps responding and reacting in a limited sense because it's an alliance of several member states which have various degrees of prioritization of Russian threat, have their domestic political problems. Governments always have to play, at least in democratic states, always have to play two-level games, both satisfying the domestic constituents on the one hand and dealing with international threats on the other hand. Sometimes they work in opposite directions. So Russia has the ability or has the advantage of having a single control over its strategy in the Baltics, in Eastern Europe, in Syria, in the Black Sea, while we're talking about 28 different countries trying to counter one way or the other. Now, and when you add the willingness of absorbing costs, both in terms of casualties in war as well as economic punishment, that gives the threat. Now, I agree that we should not necessarily in the long term overestimate the threat Russia could pose in 25 years or so. But that's quite a bit of a time that can create a lot of problems for NATO, for the overall liberal world order. And I think that's what we should be more aware of.
Number of points. Firstly, the power vacuum between between the election and the inauguration. I'd also highlight the power vacuum between the announcements about enhanced forward presence and the reality on the ground. There's a difference between rhetoric and reality, which is not an unfamiliar situation with NATO. I think it creates dangers, absolutely. But I'd also, and we need to be alive to that, which highlights the importance of getting on with it, and getting on with all the points I made earlier, and I'm not going to repeat them. But I'd also highlight, and this brings in the Russian weakness point, which I think was an economic weakness thing, which is a really important point, because just to sort of follow up on the bear analogy, a strong bear that knows that he's going to stay strong is probably an easier bear than a bear that feels that he's getting weaker and weaker all the time, recognizes that his political position or his personal popularity ratings at home are going to suffer because the economy is tanking, he can't pay teachers' salaries, he needs to continue to give a sugar rush or red meat to his population in order to maintain his popularity ratings. We saw that with the invasion of Crimea, we've seen it with the intervention into Syria. And the most dangerous autocrat is an autocrat facing trouble at home who's looking for foreign adventures. So I think that is something also we need to be alive for. You touched on integrated command. There's nothing new about this. It's just a question of relearning old lessons. But the fundamental principle is that integrated command, binding together allies, nations, agencies in a single united whole, where there is unity of command and unity of purpose, is always going to be stronger than individuals trying to do things alone. We're always, whatever we do alone is not as good as what we can do together. And if I may just have a crack at the EU point, I remember frequently arriving at Brussels Midi, and there were posters talking about the EU battle groups. Deployable, friable. Well, they're neither deployable or are they flexible, was my experience of anything to do with EU military operations. And I speak as an ex-EU operation commander in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's all about credibility. And I'm afraid to say EU battle groups lack any military credibility. Fact. The defense of Europe since 1949, Western Europe in particular, has depended totally on the certainty that America will come to the aid of Europe as attacked. So it is fundamental that we recognize the importance of the American lead within NATO, and fundamental that that transatlantic unity which binds the alliance together is in no way fractured, which potentially the development of separate EU military capabilities will do. So that is my view on the EU piece.
Thank you very much. So how can we conclude? We're definitely dealing with a bear, as I understand, with a bear with a fur that looks impressive and appealing to some. Nevertheless, we might be of the same opinion that the bear is quite skinny, but the risk is that the bear might be wounded and therefore particularly dangerous to us. So what we can do is keep on working on our credibility and our tasks at home. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists and wish you a nice discussions throughout the forum. Thank you.